on the presumption that, for me at least, the multiple versions of the Gospels are really constitutive of the problem we're discussing, whether you take basically all literally. So,
I'm sorry, did you say take it all literally?
Yeah, well, more or less. I mean, what I mean.
I don't take it all literally. I recognize the existence of all sorts of parable when Jesus is telling parables.
Yeah, when Jesus is telling parables. Why are there multiple versions?
Why the four Gospels?
Yeah, multiple. Well, I mean, I don't want to stress four, but more than one.
Well, I would go back to what Luke himself said. Luke recognizes the pre-existence of other compilations. Who he's referring to there, we have no way of knowing. Whether he's referring to Mark or other things that we've never seen, I have no way of knowing. But he writes his gospel for his audience, specifically, as he says, so that his recipient, Theophilus, may know with certainty what he has been taught. And it seems to me that Mark says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. John in the prologue lays out his purposes in identifying Jesus as the divine Logos, incarnate as the Word. And so you have, I believe, if you're asking why did they individually do so, they clearly had an audience in mind to which they wished to communicate the story of Jesus. If you're asking the bigger overarching question from a divine perspective, why would God do something like this? As I said in my opening statement, I think if we went into a number of these synoptic issues or some of the questions that we may have time to get into, by having what we might call quadraphonic stereo, we end up with I think, a much richer and deeper presentation of the ministry of the incarnate Son of God. Obviously, if I believe, like the apostles did, that this is the Logos, the Creator, who has entered into His own creation redemptively, then the ministry that was His would just be absolutely incredible in its richness. And I just simply see from a divine perspective that we are being given that fullness in God's work in history. Some of the issues that you raise, the dress issue. Remember Matthew chapter 10, whether you carry a staff or don't carry a staff. I look at the fact that if I only have Matthew and Luke, I'm not sure exactly what to do with that. But Mark and Luke. But when you have Matthew uses a different verb, and I'm referring to Matthew 10:9. If those of you want to look it up in your Bible or something like that, sometimes we're going too quickly. He uses a different verb, katapamai, to acquire, not to bring along, but to actually purchase and to acquire. When you read the three of them together, they become a harmonious presentation rather than one that I believe, if I'm representing you correctly, you see as reflecting sort of a degradation over time of Jesus' original ideal in regards to the peripatetic nature of the ministry, non-hierarchical, non-centralized. I think I'm accurately representing you. Because I approach it and I harmonize them, I do a tation on it, to use your terminology, because of what I believe about the nature of it, that ends up producing a much fuller picture than just simply having one version of it. And that's just one example. Numerous examples came up in my study of your perspective, because it seemed that both yourself and Dr. Borg would say things like, well, if you take this literally, then you miss the parabolic. No, I don't miss the parabolic, and in fact, in seeing in the multiple views, you end up with a richer perspective on a number of issues, especially in the passion narratives, but also in the straight didactic teaching of Jesus.
Okay. Your metaphor of quadraphonic, we're now talking about that second point for me. I said if when we had studied these four, they came out pretty much as independent. That's what's important for me. The dates, I grant the dates are important, because if you think that Matthew is using Mark, you better have Matthew writing later than Mark. So of course the dates are important. But in one sense, apart from that, it's not the date so much as the relationship. As I said, it's not an act of faith or anything like that. I don't think it's a presupposition. It's simply, having spent about a decade doing it, I pretty much convinced myself it looks like Mark is a major source for Matthew and Luke. And I think John has an independent tradition, but he also knows the synoptics. Those are conclusions. All of them are debatable, and I certainly didn't want to spend my life discussing them. I wanted to get on with it. So they made sense to me. But they did raise an issue of quadraphonic. I felt like I was, I don't want to put this in any prejudicial language, it was as if I was an attorney going into a court case with 4 witnesses, and I find out in the morning just before in the court that I only have 1 witness and the other 3 have heard the story from this one. Now in that case, of course, that would invalidate the whole process. But my point is that in looking at Mark and Matthew and Luke, following the presupposition or the conclusion that Matthew and Luke are copying from Mark, you're quite right, I do redactional criticism. I spent most of the 60s doing it. And at the end of that decade, I was in a monastery in the 60s. I had nothing else to do. I think other people had more fun.
Well, the fact that it was done in the 60s might say a lot too, right there. So
there was nothing much else to do in the monastery. Anyway, at the end of it, I was pretty much convinced that, going through Matthew verse by verse and trying to see now, if he is using Mark, why would he change it? Now, I never came to the conclusion that he's telling lies, he's making mistakes, he's goofing it up, any of that language at all. I thought eventually you could almost come to the point where you'd kind of cover Mark in your synopsis, cover Matthew and Luke and see what Mark said, and then see could you guess what Matthew and Luke might do with it.
Right, I
understand. Very seldom got it right. But I felt that somehow I was seeing Matthew's theology, and I was then kind of imagining the audience of Matthew for whom that would be appropriate. I mean, it was completely a circular argument because I had no other data to do it. So that's what convinced me, actually, that the process was really of gospel, that you take the story and you make it relevant to a new situation. That it came from that, rather than...
Even though you're asking me if I could just, in response to that, you, though, to do that, and this should look very familiar to you. In fact, it may give you nightmares to see it. I didn't mean to scare you with it. But is this the text that you were...
Oh, yeah.
Yes, okay. This is what he's referring to, the synopsis quater euangelion, in Greek. You are assuming, I believe, that the nature of Mark and Matthew is such, and you've used this term, maybe you can explain it in light of what you just said, that Matthew has the Spirit, and the Spirit is guiding him in altering even the historical elements of Mark's gospel. And that's because, is it your position that Matthew would have recognized the parabolic, non-historical nature of Mark, even at that that point in history? Is that how you think he would have viewed that?
I mean, I've never really thought of it.